woman in your life who will do what she must do to comfort you and calm you down and let you rest now. The woman in your life, she can rest so easily.
Hello everybody and welcome to Women's Spaces. My name is Elaine Holtz and I am your host. And I can't tell you what a privilege it is today to interview a woman by the name of Ann Marie Ginella, who is the founder of Widow Speak. And what I'm finding so interesting about this particular show is that we're going to talk about a topic that generally people just don't talk about, and that's something that is related to losing a loved one, related to death. I remember when I had Leslie de la Madra on, when we talked about rebirthing death, I got several phone calls from my viewers thanking me for at least touching on such a very sensitive subject. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ann Marie, who's going to give you just a little bit of background, and we're going to talk about the Widow Speak program. So welcome, Ann Marie. Welcome to welcome to Women's Space.
Thank you, Elaine. It's a pleasure to be here. It's funny that you slipped on that because women's spaces and women's voices and Widow Speak is all the same thing. It's about honoring the women within the culture and pulling them out.
I know it's very interesting. When I start reading all this information about some of the things that you've done, it touched my heart, to be honest with you. Not only did it touch my heart, not because of the experience, but to recognize that so many women in our culture go through this, and that there's a certain level of silence about it, that nobody really wants to talk about it. So before we continue with what Widow Speak is all about, what I would like you to do is just tell me a little bit about yourself. Go into, where you were born, your education, anything that you care to talk about.
Okay, great. Well, actually, I'd like to start at age 36, which is where I became a widow. I was 36 years old. We were together 14 years, my husband and we had 3 boys. And everything was sewn up quite sweetly and nicely for us. And my husband got sick with the flu, and 2 weeks later he was dead. So my life obviously changed dramatically that day. And then 2 weeks later I found out I was pregnant with our 4th son. So the life changed even more dramatically, not only to be a widow overnight, but also to be a widow who was pregnant. So I was always very literary. I was an English teacher at the time, literature. So I was looking for the stories of widows that I could relate to post Peter dying. So I always had gained inspiration from other women's stories, and it was my way of learning other women's stories. So when I was preparing myself for motherhood, I read stories of women, becoming mothers. And I found that there wasn't a lot of literature out there for widows. It wasn't featured. It wasn't something that we talked about, and I think that's a cultural thing. At one time, it was women wore their widowhood. In my day, in 1997, when I became a widow, there was no way to recognize widowhood or talk about it.
You're talking about a young woman being 36 years old. And suddenly, did you say you were 36 or your husband? You were
I was 36.
And your husband was he was 50?
He was 50. Yeah.
And suddenly this happens to you. Well, what were some of the feelings that you had, or how did it strike you? And all of a sudden you found yourself in this situation.
I think the most immediate and compelling was not to believe it, to be in denial, this can't be true, this can't be my life. No one ever prepares themselves in our culture for widowhood. We just don't go there. We prepare ourselves for motherhood and sisterhood and daughterhood, but we don't prepare ourselves for widowhood. So I think the first 2 years of my widowhood was in being in denial. This can't be true. Why did this happen? Trying to find some sort of understanding of how my life could have changed like that overnight without any sort of preparation for it and without any sort of understanding of sometimes when your husband gets sick and you witness him go through a year of health issues and disease and finally dying, you have some time to prepare for it. But when your husband dies suddenly, which is half of the time in widowhood, there is no way to prepare for it. So you spend a lot of time just accepting the fact that your husband is dead and that you have a new life ahead of yourself.
And then you had a fourth child. I understand when you and I were talking, actually you had one child with your husband. It was your husband's child, Peter's. Your husband's name was Peter. He had a son when you married. And then you had two other children together, and then you were pregnant with the third one. And so what happened? You gave birth, and you want to talk a little bit about that. What was that like for you, not having your husband there?
Actually, when I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after Peter died, again, that was like, how could this be? We weren't trying to have children, and Peter had been sick the last 2 weeks of his life, so it was really, I got caught. I just realized I was I felt like I was a vehicle to a miracle, that this was Peter's last gift to me, because instead of having to concentrate on his death, I had life growing inside of me. So I had to shift the focus, and for a long time, those 8 months, I was able to concentrate on life. Well, and then having 2 small children and a teenager and a son in college, it was this: how am I going to do this as a single mother? So,
my hat is off to you. I have to say that. I mean, I'm just sitting here as woman to woman. I'm thinking to myself, here, you're happily married, you have all these children, and it sounds like you didn't even know you were pregnant when he passed away. No. So that, in my mind, is actually a gift. What did you name the child?
Oh, I did name the child Pierre, because for many years I thought, this has got to be Peter's reincarnation. There was so many. I was trying to grab onto some sort of divine intervention or some sort of understanding or belief about it. Sometimes I regret having done that, because it's a big shoe for my little boy to fit, into, to be named after his father, whom he never met. But at the time, it seemed like the fitting thing to do.
Well, sitting here and just thinking about everything that you said, I'm going to move my chair a little bit over so I can be a little bit more in focus. Sitting here and thinking about what you said, if I were in your shoes, I think I would have done the same thing. And I also think that I would have been thinking in the same terms, wondering on it, first of all, just that somebody passes away so suddenly, and then all of a sudden you find yourself pregnant on a metaphysical level. You can't help but think about these things. And so I just, in my own mind, I keep thinking, boy, this was some level of character building for you, having to cope with the children and having to look at this pregnancy. I mean, it's just, my hat's off to you. And I hope that women listening to this story realize that even in some of the worst situations, being women, we carry on. We take care of the children. We take care of the family. We just move forward. Well, I know that you had your boy, and then probably life went on. And then when I first found the program, Widow Speak, it was really interesting to me. I thought, wow, Widow Speak, widow. And then all of a sudden I started thinking, I really never, in my mind, it never crosses my mind about women who lose their husbands, or men too, but what they have to go through. So can you give us a little background into how did you move from losing your husband to having your child, and then here you are forming an organization? Right. Can you go into that a little bit?
Okay, so actually after Pierre was born, I had been a teacher before Peter died. And I decided to go back to school and work on my master's, and I wrote my thesis, and it was called A Postmodern Widow, and I talked about how I became a widow. It was an understanding. It was my memoirs of becoming a widow and how I was going to wear widowhood in this postmodern era. So in doing that, I healed. I wrote my story. I had some perspective. I was able to see it in black and white and have some understanding. And as I was doing that, I thought to myself how nice it would be for other widows to have this opportunity to write their stories. So Widow Speak took form for me when I was writing my thesis back in the year 2000. So that was 3 years after Peter died. I only launched it in 2005 because I had to put it all together and find the funding for it before I did that. But it was birthed out of me writing my own story and wanting other women to have that opportunity to write their stories and find some understanding and acceptance in the process.
I understand, when I read you had a beautiful story on your website, and I'm going to scroll the website at the end of the program, so if women want to get in touch with you, in fact, you've even been so gracious that we can even put your phone number on there. But I noticed in your thesis, it said you start out, it's no longer a question of why I'm a widow, and you spell it W-I-D-O-E. I understand that now. It's why I spell widow differently. Can you go into that a little bit?
Right, I'm glad you picked up on that, because that was one of my dilemmas when I found out I was widowed at 36, is how do I wear this? Who are my role models? What does a widow look like? I mean, back in the Victorian era and prior to that, widows of our culture were dressed in black and in veils for a year, so it was identifiable. There was no way that I could identify myself as a widow by my mourning costume or by my traditions or cultural rituals. In many parts of the world, women wear white scarves, and in other parts of the world, they wear black. So there was nothing identifiable in our culture. And because I'm a writer and because I came to terms with my story, as I wrote my story, I decided to rewrite the word widow, because widow, as it's traditionally spelled, comes from the word dowager. And a dowager was a woman who could own property only because she was widowed. Before that, women couldn't own property. And I just felt like a dowager, me being a dowager, even though I was 36 and I had a home and I didn't have my husband as the co-signer, anymore, he was dead, I did not identify as a dowager. So I didn't want to spell my widowhood with the dowager symbolism. For me, that didn't work. So when I transformed it to E, I felt like it was breathing new life into it. It made it more feminine. It made it something I could imagine that was different than the woman in the black veil with the rosary beads, and it was almost a spinster-like. That I couldn't identify with that. I wanted to make my widowhood my own.
It's kind of interesting, because when you look at the word widow, the way you spell it, like the W, you've witnessed something that was very insightful, and it was a death, and it opened you up to more enlightenment, to more experimentation, to more evolution in your own spirit as a woman. I mean, that's what it sounds to me. It sounds like there was an evolution that took place, because you couldn't look at yourself as a dowager type person. I mean, when I think of dowager, when we talked on the phone, I thought of someone that their life is over. They have no more energy. They have no more to give to the world. They've lost a significant other, and that's it. Now they have to wait for another significant other in order for them to exist. So I think just the idea that you did that is very, it's not just interesting, it's very inspiring to me. Because you took a horrible situation, and you turned it into something. And as we move on, our listeners are going to see what you actually turned it into for other women, other people who are going through the same experience as you. But you also turned it into a positive affirmation that life goes on, and that the living have to look at the quality of their life, what is happening, rather than be devastated by some of the things that go on.
Right.
So, that is my take, and I just wanted to share that with you. So go ahead, continue.
Thank you. Well, so as I was starting to collect widows' stories, thinking I would like to have this Widows Speak project and gather widows' stories and archive them to make them accessible to other women who are recently widowed, I started reading stories from widows in Africa and widows in India and widows from my own backyard, whose lives were, I thought there was a woe is me in the beginning with my own story, but when I started reading other widows' stories, I realized that I was very privileged, and that for 95% of the widows in the world, it is a desperate situation when they become widowed. So Widows Speak grew from being this literary project of women being able to write their stories and share them with each other as a form of creating camaraderie and connections, but also a humanitarian project, because when we start reading these stories of other women that are like us, I felt like we needed to reach out to these women in the world. So I formed a nonprofit to make it also a humanitarian project where widows of resources and wealth could reach out to help the widows who are in need in the world. And that's all being done on the Widow Speak website today.
Well, that's absolutely wonderful. I mean, as you talk about it, I mean, I on some levels, especially after we went through discussing all this, I mean, I have empathy for what happened to you, but I don't feel sorry for you. You know, I feel that it was an experience in your life that you've actually turned around. And I understand, too, that as I was reading through a lot of the information that you had, that you're up for an award, and I just find that to be very, very interesting. I'm going to flash on the screen. I want to remind my listeners that this is Elaine. Oops, I can't even see how I'm looking at the camera. Oh, there we go. I want to remind my listeners that you're listening to Women's Spaces, and I'm your host, Elaine Holtz. And today I'm talking with Ann Marie Ginella, who is the founder of Widow Speak. And she's just informed me that she is up right now for an award. Can you go into that a little bit?
Right, okay, great. State Farm Insurance sponsors an award called the Embrace Life Award every year for 5 widows who have looked at their widowhood and actually done something with it. So I don't know, they must have found my website because they got a hold of me and said, we think your work is amazing, we would like for you to be involved in this nomination process. So every year 5 widows are featured, they receive a gift of $10,000 and they're flown to New York City for the weekend for a gala benefit where they're acknowledged and they can continue their work.
So you go to New York, you're already part of the team that's evaluating the award?
No, I've been nominated to receive an award, so I could be the one that says, that gets to go to New York for this gala event, and $10,000 gets to go into the Widow Speak project, which would be very nice.
How do they determine? I mean, are there anything that you have to do?
One of my board members from the Widow Speak project wrote an essay. You had to submit a 1,000-word essay on who the widow was that you were nominating and why. But they actually contacted us and asked us to submit something. And because they knew that we were dealing with lots of widows, every day, so that we would have widows for their award. So I see that we'll be working together in the future too, because they do this every year, 5 widows.
Well, also the fact that you're getting acknowledged, that you have done something to support women. Because I was looking, it was really interesting. I was reading about Yoko. You had in your bio, you had an individual release on your website, and it happened to talk about Yoko Ono being a widow. And suddenly, it really got to me. It was like there was just a small period of time where we've acknowledged that for her, but yet there was very little emphasis on it. I mean, it was almost like we were all mourning John Lennon, but didn't have an opportunity to reach out and mourn for her.
That's interesting, yeah.
And I never recognized that.
Which so often happens with widows of famous men, that it's really about the man's story, and at what point does it become about the widow's story? And I think Yoko Ono's done a great job of doing that, creating her own life beyond John. She was an artist before she met him, and she's continued that. She's continued his mission too, which is great. But so often, the figurehead widows are the widows we hear about, and Widow Speak really wants to look at the widows that aren't talked about. The grandmothers that we all have like hankies in our pockets. I was looking for the widow's story when I was recently widowed, and it wasn't until I started writing my book that I realized 4 of my grandmothers were widowed. Why wasn't their story ever talked about in my family? Why didn't I ever see them as the widowed women?
So, as you say this, the same thing with my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother was a widow. My mother was a widow. My mother lost my father when she was, she wasn't quite as young as you, but she had just reached a goal and was going to share it with him, and he went to work, and that was the last that we saw of him. So when you start really thinking about it, you really see that as women, we are not acknowledged, that when these dramas or traumas happen, this form of it, and it's so final. Mm-hmm. It's the finality where a divorce or other things that happen that create separation are not as final. It doesn't feel like there's that much to cope with. And another thing that you said that I really want to validate, and it really goes in tune with my show. My show is dedicated to ordinary women doing extraordinary things. And I've been on the show for 3 years. I've been doing it. And just like women like yourself coming on, doing these absolutely extraordinary things that none of us really hear about.
Right.
It's not on the mainstream media. It's not on the radio, and I just can't tell you how honored I am to have had you in the studio and to talk to you. And just before I want to flash this on the screen, and I'd like you to explain this a little bit, if you can.
Oh, this is the cover shot from an UN report that was published in 2000 after the Conference of Women in Beijing, China, where widowhood came to the forefront as a global issue. As we continue to massacre each other in wars, we're going to continue to create widows and all of the fallout that means for the children of widows. So it's an invisible, that cover shows that it's the invisible, it's the black and white of widowhood that Widow Speak is trying to bring to the forefront, making the awareness of widows more prevalent in the lives. That we all know that our grandmothers are widows, and we know their stories. You could write your mother's story and submit it to Widow Speak, and all of a sudden, her story is known as the widow, the woman that carries on in the face of death, continues to raise the children, and carry on.
Well, it's very interesting. I want to write my mother's story.
I would love for you to.
Because the courage. She never worked after she got married, and she was always 75 pounds overweight, and she ended up going to work. She ended up having a whole career and having actually a room named after her. It just creates such emotion in me when you think of it.
That's the stories we're looking for, because had she not been widowed, you don't know if she would have been propelled to do that sort of work in her life. So it's like we are given, widowhood is definitely a cloak of heaviness, but it's also a gift, because the woman has to look inside of herself and say, who am I, and what am I going to do with this story? What am I going to do with this hood that I've just been given to wear? It's not sisterhood, it's not motherhood, it's now widowhood.
And what am I going to do with the rest of my life without my mate, without my friend? I mean, it's a very different experience, and I just want you to know that I really validate for you what you're doing, and I hope that if there's any women out there that are experiencing this, that they will get in touch with you, because we need to hear our stories, whether it's widowhood or whatever our story is. Right. Women need to understand that we have that inner strength. We have that ability to move on, to take care of the children, to take care of our lives.
And we need to rely on each other to do that. And that's the idea of Widow Speak, is that we create a web of support around the widows of the world by connecting them to each other's stories. So I've got a woman writing in from Brooklyn who has something in common with a young woman up in Portland, and I connect them. So I implore everyone who knows a widow or has a widow in the family to check into Widow Speak's website and consider submitting a story. We also offer writing services, so we can write the story if you're muddling around in it, if it's too emotional for you. There's many ways that we can support you in getting that story and that image of that woman. If you visit the website, you'll see that it's a portrait gallery as well of widows from around the world. So you can see the many colors, the many shapes, the many customs that come along with widowhood. It's really, I'm looking at creating a whole discourse of widowhood on the website.
Well, Ann Marie, I hate to say this, my friend, but time goes by very quickly in the studio. Mm-hmm. And although you've already talked a little bit to our audience, my show is dedicated to ordinary women doing extraordinary things, like I said, but I also have another little idea in my little trick bag, and that is all the women that come on the show is to encourage other women to do something in the world, do something for each other, do something for peace. And I hope that the women that I'm talking to can provide that kind of inspiration. So I'm going to invite you to just go ahead and look at the camera and just say what's ever in your heart. Don't hold back. Just whatever you feel is important to let other women know about the program, about yourself, and encourage them to, like I said, to get involved.
Thank you. Well, I encourage people to check out the Widow Speak website. Naturally, because we can learn a lot about what widowhood looks like, and instead of it being the hidden, invisible hood of women, that we can start having more empathy and more connectivity between women in all of the hoods that they wear. And also, what I learned in my own widowhood is that, I never would have imagined this life for myself, but I've learned to look inside at my inner strengths, and I think I pull the strengths of my widowed grandmothers too, and to carry on with, this is a gift too. My life is a gift, and what am I going to do with it? Am I going to woe is me the rest of my life because my husband died 10 years ago, or am I going to transform this grief and do something that creates renewal and a life of purpose for myself? So I encourage women to find that same inner path.
Well, my friend, I couldn't have said it any better. And I want to thank you so much for honoring me by being a guest on Women's Spaces. And thank you, thank you, thank you. And like I said at the end, I'm going to scroll all the information.
Okay, great.
And to my listeners, I'm having trouble with the camera today. I don't know what it is, and that's why if I'm not looking at you correctly, I'm trying to adjust it. But anyway, I want to remind you, everybody, once again, that this is Elaine Holtz with Women's Spaces, saying thank you so much for watching, and to remind all my listeners, particularly my women listeners, that each one of us need to do a little bit for peace, a little bit for the world, a little bit for the children. I mean, I read today in the paper that there were 2 children just taken out of their home and sent to some sort of detainment center. And I asked myself, would that happen if, as women, when we read that in the paper, if we were a little more active and a little more assertive in saying that we want a good life and we want fairness and justice for the women and children in this world? Anyway, this is Elaine Holtz with Women's Spaces, once again saying goodbye for now.
The woman in your life will do what she must do to comfort you and calm you down and let you rest now. The woman in your life, she can